welcome to the third of our Holy Week devotions. I hope you're all doing okay out there. Today we're going to look at what happens on the Tuesday and Wednesday in the Holy Week story, again based on the book The Longest Week by Nick Page. So we'll dive straight in there. And the first thing that happens as the disciples and Jesus are leaving Bethany into Jerusalem is they pass the fig tree that we talked about yesterday, the one that Jesus had cursed. And the disciples are very surprised to see that it's withered away, that it has completely died. And they're exclaiming that and how weird it is when Jesus says, well, as I said, anything that doesn't bear fruit will die. Well, what's he talking about there? Because Jesus isn't generally particularly interested in fruit trees. But the clue is in that mark and sound which we talked about, that the two parts of this story are separated by another story and they're commenting on that. Well, in between we have Jesus going in the temple and causing complete mayhem, where he's turning the tables over, as we talked about yesterday. And he's saying that this has been made into a den of thieves. So what does the fig tree have to say to relate to that part of the story? Well, it seems his criticism, I think, is aimed at the temple. The temple establishment, this whole system that's been built up around the temple to keep it operating, is exploiting people. And in exploiting people, it is not glorifying God, it is not bringing people to God, it is not serving to bring glory to God. And so it's not producing fruit like the tree. And so Jesus is saying that this temple institution is going to die. It's going to wither and die like the tree. And within about 40 years of Jesus' death, that is what happens when the Romans in AD 70 destroy the temple after laying siege to Jerusalem. And we'll touch a bit more on that in a little bit. And where does Jesus go once he's inside the city? So we've passed the fig tree now, and we've kind of gone down into the city. He doesn't go to the lower city. He goes to the temple, which seems like a slightly odd place. By this point, Jesus is a marked man. The chief priests, the teachers of the law, they do not like Jesus one bit, and they want to kill him, and he'd have known that. The only reason they haven't is that they can't get him alone, basically. They cannot find a way to arrest him that won't start a riot, and that's the one thing they absolutely don't want, with the Romans keeping such a close eye on everything that they're doing. Jesus actually goes, as said, to the temple. And the reason for this is probably partly because it was such a big open space, one of the only ones in Jerusalem. And that's actually why even in the days of the early church, the church met in the temple. Even during times of persecution, the church was meeting there right up until the destruction of the temple itself. So Jesus is here, and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the teachers of the law see him there, and they decide they're going to trap him. They want to get him to say something to make the crowd turn against him, so they have a reason to arrest him, to hand him over to the Romans, and hopefully to have him executed. And so there are 4 questions. The first question targets his authority as a religious leader. They ask him on whose authority he's saying the things he's saying. Now, all throughout his ministry, that's this sort of, it's made clear that Jesus has an authority, that he speaks, but he doesn't speak as the other teachers of the law do. He says something and he never backs it up with what past rabbis have thought. He's not referring to the great teachers of the past. He just says it, and it has authority, and people are convicted that that is true. And Jesus had none of the formal training of the other scribes. He's not a man who you'd normally expect to be preaching. So this question isn't entirely unusual, but it does give Jesus a dilemma. He can say that his authority comes from God, which is the true answer. That will result in, obviously, an instant charge of blasphemy. That would end his ministry then and there. The other alternative is to say that it's from human means, which again is, well, it's lying, but it's also ending his ministry. But Jesus doesn't go for either of those options. Instead, he says Well, I'll answer your question if you answer one of mine. He likes doing this. He always answers a question with another question. And he says, well, where did the baptism of John get its authority from? So John the Baptist, back at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, was baptizing people in the Jordan, and the Pharisees and the religious leaders didn't like that he was doing that. I mean, he called them a brood of vipers. It's quite understandable they didn't get along. And at this point, all these chief priests, these priests are stuck. Because what do they say? And they actually have a discussion amongst themselves where they say, well, if we say it's from man that he's kind of just come along and decided to do it, well, then the people might attack us. There'll be a riot because they believe that John was a prophet. But if we say that he got his power from God, then the answer is easy. Well, why didn't you listen to him then? Why did you let him be put to death? And so they're trapped, and they say, well, we don't know. And Jesus says, well, then I'm not going to tell you where my authority comes from. So Jesus kind of dances his way around that question. But he does then answer in some parables, at least in some of the gospel versions. Every gospel is slightly different, so we're kind of flipping from one to the other here as we put it together. And these parables are a lot of them talk about how there's this big the idea is that the people who are expecting to be on the inside end up on the outside, and the people expected to be on the outside on the inside. And this is not just a fairy tale. What Jesus is saying here, effectively, in earshot of the leaders of the Jewish people, is that you may think you're special because you are God's chosen people, but God can turn that all upside down and you will be thrown out. Because you've killed prophets, you're about to kill me, and God will invite others in. So obviously, they're not gonna like that at all, and they send in more questioners. The next question is a political question. It aims to make him a liability to the Romans, because if he upsets the Romans, they know they can get rid of him instantly. So he is asked, should we pay our taxes to Caesar? So everyone in the Roman Empire had to pay taxes, pay money to the Roman government in Rome, to Caesar. And Jesus says, well, can you hand me a Roman coin? And they hand it to him. And in some ways that's his answer. Because what he's pointing out there, they're carrying these coins around. It's almost like they've bought into the system already. They've been using Roman money, they're using the benefits Rome brings, so it kind of answers the question already, even when some of them are making a big noise about, well, we shouldn't have to pay this money to Caesar. They're partaking in all the benefits. So he's kind of pointed out the hypocrisy in the question already. But he then looks at it and says, well, whose picture's on it? And obviously the picture on the coins was of Caesar. There's Caesar, and he says, well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but give to God what is God's. And that can be interpreted in different ways. Some people have interpreted it as basically saying you need to pay your tax, which I'm sure some people on the Isle of Man would disagree with in certain circumstances. But I think it's actually a bit more subtle than that. What Jesus is kind of saying is, well, you've bought into the system, that's what you have to pay. But what's more important, you shouldn't be worrying about the money you give to Caesar. Worry about what of your life that you're giving to God. How are you glorifying God in your life? And that's a question we all have to battle with all the time, is what are we giving to God? While we've got all these other worries on, what is it that we are giving to God? And so Jesus is dispatched with a second round of questions. The third round comes from some Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees were kind of almost an aristocratic class. These are quite wealthy people. And they didn't believe that there was resurrection from the dead. They didn't believe there was any form of afterlife. They thought that this is what you've got and that's it. And that kind of works for them because they're very comfortable, thank you. But it doesn't work so well outside of the rich classes. Those who are poor don't have any hope with that message. And so they pose a riddle to Jesus. They tell a story about a woman who was married to a man and he died, and then another man married that man's brother, which was normal in those days. Then he died, and it goes on till he's married 4 or 5 men, and then she dies. He says, well, if there's an afterlife, who will she be married to? That's an interesting question, and I definitely have given that some thought in my time. But Jesus' answer is actually kind of to accuse these scriptural experts, the kind of fundamentalist believers of their day, because they didn't believe anything that wasn't in the Torah, which is why they didn't believe in resurrection, among other reasons. He kind of says to them, well, you don't know your scriptures, because he refers to a part of the Bible where God is speaking to Moses and says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. By Moses' time, these three men are long dead. But as Jesus says, God is not the God of the dead, he's the God of the living. So these people are in some way alive. But he says, God's basically, just because we can't comprehend it here, God can work it out. God's ways are different from ours. And so he kind of dispatched that question firstly by pointing out that they're kind of missing the point, that there is something in the Bible that he's turned around on them. But also I think there's an element of frustration and probably in his voice at this point, because they've taken a widow in this story who is among the most vulnerable and downtrodden classes in Jewish society. They have no power, nothing, no way of making money. They've taken them and just turned her a tragic story into a riddle. And in some ways, does that not just show how disconnected their thought processes were from daily life? And perhaps that's a lesson we can take today. Take a lesson that if our theology doesn't work in the real world, maybe we have to look at our theology and not get caught up thinking up these great ideas if they don't apply into the here and the now. Then we come to the fourth question. This question is brought by a scribe. Now, scribes are basically secretaries. They're bureaucrats. They would be literate, so they could read and write, keep records. They're fairly high up in sort of society, but tended to be quite poor of themselves, because they weren't allowed to be paid for their work, and that will become more relevant later. But what's different about this question is not an attempt to trick Jesus. This is a genuine question, and a scribe has broken ranks, as it were. He kind of switched sides, and he asked Jesus, which is the most important commandment? And Jesus answers, it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might, and all your strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. Quite a well-known answer to sum up all of the law with love, which is great. And the scribe then repeats it back, which was quite a common sort of method to reaffirm something. And at the end he adds something. He says, and this is better than all the sacrifices and blood offerings we could offer. Now, for a member of the temple establishment to say that in the middle of the temple, that is kind of earth-shattering. That is a complete turnaround. He is aligning himself with Jesus very clearly in that statement, and I'm sure that did not make him popular. And at that point, that support seems to have given Jesus the impetus to turn things around, and he starts telling stories and parables, and he says, basically, woe to the scribes, because they are taking advantage of people. Now, one presumes he wasn't talking about the scribe who'd just been nice to him, the scribe who'd just come and sort of expressed an understanding of him. But the scribes in general, as I said, they were a relatively poor class because they couldn't be paid for their work. So pious Jews, people who were following faith, were expected to help them out, to give them hospitality, food, money, whatever it was, to help them. And there are a few stories of scribes who lived very poor lives because they weren't supported, but there are a lot more stories of scribes who took advantage of that generosity and that hospitality. And as a result of that, they are kind of taking away the little that those poor people who are supporting them already even had, and they're kind of just mooching off them. And Jesus is saying, kind of, you're wearing white, you wear white robes, which was a symbol of being part of the temple establishment, a symbol of purity. But you are feeding off the vulnerable, and you're not doing what you should be doing. And at that moment, there's a woman, a widow, who puts her coin in a little in the offering, and Jesus kind of said, "Well, see her. She's given everything to God. And she is basically saying she's holier than the scribes. These are two groups who are not well off, but the scribes are sort of taking advantage of hospitality, even though they're meant to be the ones who are holy. They're the ones dressed in white, while the widow has shown more faith in God in that one simple action. But again, this feels like a dig at the temple system, doesn't it? It feels like a dig at the idea at this system that meant that widows had to put their last coin in the box. They felt compelled to do that. And I think Jesus, throughout this story, he is pointing out again and again the ways in which the temple is failing in its duty to share the message of God, to glorify God, and to be a place of holiness and prayer, and instead is becoming exploitative money-making machine. So Jesus now leaves Jerusalem, but not before making some prophecies about the temple, and he starts to prophesy that this building will be torn down, and not one stone will stay on top of each other. Now, that would prove to be part of what came out in his trial. They had the Pharisees, the chief priests, got witnesses that said he said he would tear down the temple. Now, Jesus isn't making a threat here. Jesus is prophesying, but these words were twisted, and they're part of the justification that the chief priests used to have Jesus condemned to death. But as he moves further out of the city, he kind of expands on that and talks about this day that's coming where everything will be destroyed, where the status quo will be shaken up. And he's talking about this, and the genre in this area is apocalyptic literature. Now, apocalypse for us normally means the end of the world, but really it's just a word that means a revelation, something new, a seeing into the future of what's going to happen. So Jesus here is not necessarily talking about the end of the world. In fact, what he seems to be talking about is the fact that in AD 70, and this has happened around AD 33, so it's about roughly 35 years later, 37 years, the temple was actually going to be destroyed by the Romans, and to this day has not, in Jerusalem there is not a temple on the Temple Mount. And then the Romans laid siege to the city, and it was a terrible battle. And Jesus is talking about all this, but what's the point of that? And this is one of the areas where scholars often are poring through it, looking for clues about when the end of the world will happen. And I don't think that's the point. Partly, I think Jesus is mostly talking about events that have now happened. He's talking about events that were going to be massively impactful in the lives of those who were listening to him. I don't think he is particularly talking about the end of the world. He does talk about the day of the Lord, where everything will be redeemed, which we would understand as Jesus coming again. So yes, that's in the future, but his message is not about being fearful. It's not about here's the timeline. In fact, he's quite explicit that there isn't, and we can't know the timeline. The message seems to be, well, right now we need to be doing the right thing. We need to be ready. There's parables he tells around this time where he talks about being ready for the bridegroom to come home at a party, or being ready for a thief in the night. And the words need to be actually be ready, do good works, have faith, spread the gospel. And that's something that his disciples are going to need to hear very soon, because he won't be with them anymore, and they'll be tasked with carrying his message throughout the whole world. So that's Tuesday, and we've seen Jesus go back into Bethany. On the Wednesday, there's not a massive amount that happens. Some of the Gospels actually place it on Wednesday that Jesus is anointed with oil, which we kind of talked about in Rocks as happening on the Friday before, or the Saturday before Palm Sunday, and that's kind of up for interpretation there. But the one thing that I'm going to pick up on is that this is the point where Judas goes out in the night and goes to see the chief priests. And this is where Judas has made the decision to betray Jesus. Why? Why now of all times? And this story takes place in certain Gospels right after the incident with the perfume, where Jesus is anointed. So there's some connection there, it seems to be, of money, that this money has been wasted instead of spent on the poor. But we're also told that Judas is a thief. Well, there's a couple of reasons I can think of for why Judas may have decided to betray Jesus at this point. One potential is that he is simply disillusioned, that Jesus is not who he thought he was. Maybe he was expecting a warrior king to come in and defeat the Romans, and Jesus wasn't doing that. Or maybe it was simply that this waste of money that could have gone to the poor just disillusioned him and thought, well, this man's not really for the poor, and that he'd missed the point of the anointing that we covered before, and he's just seeing it as a waste of money. The other potential is that this is an opportunistic event, that Judas, who's followed along with Jesus, sees that the tide is changing, that every day it becomes more and more dangerous to be associated with Jesus. And the offer of 30 pieces of silver is about 60 days' wages. So that's not a bad payday, really, is it? It's what he'd earned in 60 days. And maybe he thought, well, I'm poor, what do I have to lose? I want to get out of this situation. We don't know, really. The Bible doesn't say explicitly. I'm inclined to think it's something to do with money, but we don't get into Judas's motive. We don't get details, and perhaps they don't matter. The point is, though, that at this point Judas has set events in motion that lead up to the crucifixion. Now, what was Judas's? What was he selling? Because we talk about Judas betraying Jesus, and I know for many years I was sort of thinking, well, how's he betraying him? The information he seems to be selling is Jesus' location. So during the day, the priests can't arrest Jesus because he is in the city surrounded by crowds of people. And then he disappears at night and they don't know where he is. Well, Judas knows that he often goes to the Garden of Gethsemane on the hill outside Jerusalem and prays there. And so that, I think, is information that Judas is selling to the chief priest. That is the information that he is betraying Jesus with. And that's where we're going to leave our story, leave the story today. We'll be back tomorrow, obviously talking a bit about Maundy Thursday and the Last Supper and Jesus' arrest. But I want to leave you with the questions I have each day here. And I guess the question that I want to ask is, what is it that we get distracted by? I'm thinking here particularly of the question about taxes to Caesar. So the people have got distracted by the rights and wrongs of paying taxes to Caesar rather than giving everything to God. And Jesus makes it clear, actually, no, the bigger problem here is that we are giving to God what we should be giving to God. And that's not just referring to money, it's referring to time and talents and all sorts as well. So I guess what I want to ask you, and maybe you could comment below if you feel comfortable, is what things do you want to make an effort to give to God in this time? What areas of your life do you feel like you want to use more for God? So it's a difficult question, it's a lot to think about, but if you feel comfortable with it, do leave a comment below. It's great to discuss them a bit. I say I'll have a new video tomorrow. Hope you're enjoying this series and stay safe, and I'll see you tomorrow.